Tonight we will be reading Genesis chapter 50, 15 through 26. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil we did to him." So they sent message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave us this command before he died. Say to Joseph, 'Please forgive the transgressions of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now, please forgive the transgressions of the servants of God of your father.'" Joseph wept when they said these things, when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them as he spoke kindly to them. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation, the children of the third of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob." Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. This is the word of the Lord. Tonight we will be studying those verses that I just read. To summarize them, Joseph's brothers were scared that he would mistreat them because of what they did to him when he was young. They sent a messenger to Joseph asking for forgiveness. Their brothers offered to be slaves, but Joseph was not upset and agreed to take care of their family. Tonight we will be looking specifically at Genesis 50:20. "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." What do we learn about God from this passage? God is powerful and in control. Psalms 22:28 says, "For the kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations." God is in control of everything that goes on in this world, and he was in control of Egypt. God knew that a leader was needed to save the people from the famine. God might have been using Joseph's trials to prepare him to be the leader Egypt needed. Sometimes my parents will get me in trouble or make me do work, and it isn't fun, but it helps me be a better person. We also learn that God will take care of those who love him. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things will work together for good, and for those who are called according to his purpose." God loved Joseph and had a plan for him, and God meant it all for good. God also loves us and knows that in the end, all things will work out for us. What do we learn about how we should live from this passage? We should trust in God even when things are rough. 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me.'" God is at work in our weakness. This was true for Joseph, Paul, and it is true for us as well. We don't know the will of God, but we know that he loves us. So we trust in him, even when life is hard. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Warren, for your reading and your study of that text there at the end of the book of Genesis. The book of Exodus picks up right where Genesis leaves off. And so I think it's a fitting and appropriate thing to think about the book of Genesis and how it concludes, and we're actually going to spend a little bit of our time tonight in the book of Genesis to explain what brings us to the book of Exodus. Why is Joseph there? Why are the children of Israel there? What brought them to that point? What circumstances led to the crisis of the slavery in Egypt and God calling them out with a mighty hand and delivering his people? Why, first of all, though, should we study the book of Exodus? So as you know, we're engaging in about a 40-lesson series on the book of Exodus, which will, if you count our singing nights, will take a year. So for the next year, we'll be studying the book of Exodus, and for any endeavor that takes that long, that much time, that much attention, why should we care? Why should we spend our time studying this book? Well, there's a lot that we can learn from the book of Exodus, but I think fundamentally it teaches us about God. God is the subject, if you will. He's the actor in the book of Exodus. He's the one who is moving in history to accomplish his purposes. There's a mistake that is often made in the book of Exodus, in studying the book of Exodus. This has been made, if you're familiar with liberation theology, for instance. And I heard someone make this point. I can't remember who. I would give them credit, but I can't think of who it was. But the point made is, a lot of people read Exodus and think, well, the purpose of the book of Exodus is that God allies himself with the oppressed. And that's not the purpose of the book of Exodus at all. There were a lot of slaves in Egypt who were not freed. There were a lot of Semitic peoples in Egypt besides the Hebrews, besides the children of Israel. They weren't freed. The Egyptians were cruel taskmasters for many other peoples in many other groups. This is a book about how God in his love set his affection on his covenant people and delivered them from oppression. This isn't a promise to us that when things are bad, God's going to show up and miraculously send plagues upon our cruel and unusual boss. That's not what this book is about, and we shouldn't take that lesson. This book is not about us. It's about God. And Exodus teaches us that God will redeem his people. It teaches us that God will defeat the tyrants who oppose him. In the case of Exodus, it's the Pharaoh. That God is a law-giving God. That God is a holy God. That's the second, really the biggest single section of the book of Exodus has to do with the tabernacle. Its planning and its construction. God revealing his plans for it to Moses on the mountain, and then its construction at the end, and ultimately God coming and dwelling in the temple at the end of the book of Exodus. And that demonstrates something about God and his holiness. The Bible also tells us, or the book of Exodus also teaches us a lot about man. So it's a book about God fundamentally, but we learn a lot about man through the pages of this book. We learn how we should behave in the face of oppression and tyranny. So think about the Hebrew midwives that Larry's team will be covering. How they acted and how they opposed the evil commands of Pharaoh. It teaches us what it takes to be a godly leader. That's one of the great lessons of the book of Exodus is it's the rise of Moses, especially the first part of the book. You get a man who starts out being very impulsive, very much driven by emotion. And after a period of many, many decades, is he finally prepared to be the leader he needs to be? And there's all kinds of lessons to learn about being a godly leader that we can learn from this book, and it's particularly about Moses. But it also teaches us about the rebellious heart of man. Because as soon as the children of Israel are out, shortly after they promise, as God speaks his commands at the mount to them, and they shake in terror, they say, "We will obey." It's just weeks after that they're fashioning a golden calf. So it tells us a lot about the rebellious heart of man. So we learn a lot about God. We learn a lot about man through the book of Exodus. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to first provide an outline of the book of Exodus. Secondly, we're going to talk about authorship, who wrote this book. 3, the background, what events led up to the events of the Exodus. And 4, finally, key themes that we draw from the book of Exodus. A rough outline of the book of Exodus might look this way. There's a lot of different ways to outline the book of Exodus. A common way is through geography. I was looking back at notes I had on Exodus from 10 years ago, maybe 10 plus years ago. And the note I had taken is, well, the book is laid out by geography. And that was and that's a lot of people take that task. You got the children of Israel in Egypt. And then you have the children of Israel on the way to Mount Sinai. You have the children of Israel at Sinai. And then you have the children of Israel leaving Sinai. And you got in the wilderness. So you could do it by geography. But I really don't think that is that may be an okay way to think about the book and subdivide the book, but it's really, in my mind, not the best way to organize the book. The book is bifurcated, and a lot of books of the Bible are. You can really find about the midway point, about midway, chapter 20. It's a 40-chapter book. About chapter 20, you get the midway. And I think you'll see that in the outline here. And that culminates at the centerpiece of the book with God giving the law at Sinai, the Ten Commandments, and then the book of the covenant that follows. We'll mention that a little bit more later on. But the first half is what got us there. It's the events. It's leading us to the children of Israel. It's the rise of Moses. It's the plagues. It's the children of Israel and the Exodus and the Passover. And their wars with varying countries, and then their arrival at Sinai and the giving of the law. That's the centerpiece. And then the remaining parts of it are God gives the law, the instructions for the tabernacle, the rebellion, as you see on the screen. So these are the sections we're going to break the book of Exodus up into, and this roughly corresponds to the different teams that will be attacking this book and trying to understand it and teach it. So the first section, Genesis 1 through 6, is the bondage of Israel, their hard slavery, what events led to that slavery, what was their slavery like, and the rise of Moses as the leader, as the hero of Israel. The second section is the exodus of Israel from Egypt. And then you have Israel traveling to Sinai. You have God giving the law, which are the Ten Commandments, and then the book of the covenant. God gives instructions for the tabernacle, and then there's a brief break. He's talking several chapters about the tabernacle. And there's a break about the rebellion of the golden calf and the necessity of Moses' intercession on behalf of the children of Israel. It's one of the most important parts of the book, actually. And the fact that it occurs so abruptly in the midst of all the tabernacle commands, that's telling. It's telling this is really important. It's a little bit like in a movie. You think about the second in the Lord of the Rings, the Two Towers. In the first movie, the whole crew is together, and it's a happy time, and they're traveling. It's the Fellowship of the Ring. At the end of the movie, they split up, and they're in multiple places. And so in the second movie, you get some time with Frodo, and then you cut over here, and you get some time. Meanwhile, it's the meanwhile section. You get some stuff going on over here, and then you come back to the main plot. That's a little bit of what Exodus 32 through 35 is. Moses is up on the mountain. Well, meanwhile, what's been happening back in the camp? And it's not been good. And the children of Israel have turned back to their paganism. And they have, in the matter of weeks, fully and completely abandoned their commitment to the covenant. And God has told Moses, listen, I'm going to kill them all. They're rebellious, and I'm going to make a great nation out of you. And Moses says, no, Lord, that won't do. They're children of Abraham just like I am. That's a really important section. You see a lot about Jesus and his intercession in that section as well. And then finally, the actual building and completion of the tabernacle. And then we mentioned that the tabernacle teaches us about the holiness of God. And it's easy for us to say the tabernacle section is the boring section. And to be candid, it can feel that way. It's a lot of repetition. But once you start looking in what's happening in the construction of the tabernacle, you start to realize that, what's interesting is you come to the Holy of Holies, everything's made out of gold, and in the next section it's out of silver, and then the perimeters it's made out of bronze. What does that tell us about what holiness is? I've come to the conclusion that the best definition of holiness is that which approximates God. The closer you come to God, or a thing is to God, the more holy it becomes. And certain articles of the tabernacle were right up against the most holy place, and they were holy. It didn't matter if they were just a shovel. But because they were in close proximity to God, they were holy. So holy is really just an adjective that describes that which approximates God. That's the best definition I can come up with. And you see that very clearly in the construction of the tabernacle. So that's our outline. Some of the major players in the book of Exodus. Well, the Lord God. He is the main character. He is the hero of the plot. And, Moses is Moses is Robin to the Batman. He's an important figure, but God is the hero. You have Pharaoh as the tyrant who opposes God and his people. You have Aaron, whose Moses is. There's supposed to be apostrophe there. Moses' brother. When I was a student, there was always a debate about, do you put an apostrophe after Moses? And these days, yes, they've changed the rules of grammar, so Jesus and Moses's and Jesus's. But for a long time, this is just a little tidbit you may not care to know, but a long time the rule was if a name ends in S, you still should add apostrophe S, except for Moses and Jesus. They were the two exceptions. So Moses apostrophe brother, that's from the Chicago Manual of Style from when I was a student. So I did it both ways because I just don't know. I still don't know, but you're supposed to do apostrophe S after Moses. Moses' brother is Aaron. Jethro, or sometimes called Reuel, is Moses' father-in-law, priest of Midian. Very important figure, by the way. All kinds of questions about why is the priest of Midian giving instructions and advice to Moses? Zipporah, Moses' wife, Miriam, Moses' sister, Joshua, Moses' assistant, Bezalel, and Aholiab are two artisans that helped with the construction of the tabernacle. They feature prominently at the end of the book. Those are major players. There's others, but you're going to see those names as we study this book. All right, the Exodus. What is the title of the book? Well, in the Hebrew Bible, the title of the book is These Are the Names. And if you open to Exodus chapter 1, verse 1, you'll see why it's called that. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. In the Hebrew Bible, the books are always named after the first few words of the book. So these are the names. In the Latin and Greek Bible, it was called the Exodus. And then we took the Latin and Greek name. We didn't take the Hebrew name in English. So these are the names of the book of Exodus. It is authored by Moses. We're going to talk more about that in detail, but leave it for now. Moses is the author of this book. The date is either 1446 BC, which is, I think, the date that we'll probably follow here. I'll leave that for Dustin. But some will argue that it's 1275 BC. That is for the lesson next week for us to get into that. But we'll stick with 1446 BC as the date of the Exodus. Authorship. So who wrote the book of Moses? Well, up until the 1700s, it was just pretty widely accepted that it was written by Moses. Moses wrote the book. Passages like Deuteronomy 31, 24 through 26 were hints at this, in addition to the fact that so many people, including Jesus, go back to the books of the law and refer to them as Moses. So when Moses had finished writing the words of this book in a law to the very end, Moses commanded the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, take this book of the law and put it by the side of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for you, for a witness against you. Now, is this referring to the 5 books of Moses, or is this referring to the book of the law, let's call it? That's an open question. Well, it certainly doesn't refer to the end of Deuteronomy, because the end of Deuteronomy contains the death of Moses. The ancient rabbis, they actually thought that Moses wrote the account of his own death. I don't think many people think that is the case now. It's very likely that Joshua, his assistant, penned some of those words and acted as somewhat of an editor. I don't think that bothers anybody. But Moses is the author of the books of the law. God is the author. Moses is really the penman. And that for a long time is what everybody accepted. Yeah, maybe Joshua added this, that, here or there. You know, maybe place names were updated in later centuries to reflect modern names. That actually happens in English Bibles, by the way. We do that too. We'll take a name that we'll take the name for Philistia and drop it in, and we'll refer to Palestine, and we'll do it very anachronistically. We do that. They did that. And so sometimes maybe a scribe took the classic examples in Exodus chapter 1 with reference to the town of Ramses, which was not called Ramses back then. It was called that sometime later. And so, yeah, I think we all leave room for the fact that later scribes updated place names. Maybe Joshua added the final chapters of Deuteronomy. That doesn't bother anybody. But Moses wrote the bulk of the book. However, in the 1700s, this started to be challenged. H.B. Whitter noticed in 1711 that in Genesis 1 and 2, you have different names for God. And he argued that this meant the author had multiple competing sources. So in Genesis chapter 1, God is referred to as Elohim. And in Genesis chapter 2, he is referred to as Yahweh. And so H.B. Whitter thought, well, maybe. I believe H.B. Whitter thought that Moses, he still held to Moses as being the author, but he thought that Moses actually had it in 2 columns. And, maybe over time they kind of merged together into one. And so he said, that's interesting. Genesis 1 and 2 have different names for God, so maybe that means there are different sources there that got compiled together. Well, in 1752, Jean Estruc, who was the personal physician of King Louis of France, he actually said, what happens if you take this pattern, like sometimes it's God, sometimes it's Elohim, and sometimes it's Yahweh. I'll explain in a minute how you can tell in your English which is which. What if you continue this pattern? He read it all the way through Exodus 2. Well, eventually scholars came along and said, and read it the whole way through and said, well, really what you have in the book of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are 2 sources. One source they call God Yahweh, and another source they call him Elohim, and sometimes they call him both because they tried to mix them together. That was the argument. In 1805, W.M.L. DeWitt suggested that Deuteronomy was the book found during Josiah's reform and that it was actually written in that time. So Deuteronomy, he argued, was a product of the 7th century. BC. No way written by Moses, according to this guy. And then by 1878, Julius Wellhausen gives the classical formulation for what we call the documentary hypothesis. And I'm going to take a minute to explain why this is really important. And he suggested that really there are 4 sources. The J source, or the Yahweh source, the E source, or the Elohim source, the D source, the Deuteronomy source, the Josiah source, and the P source, the priestly source, which he says was written by Ezra and his comrades after the return from exile, and he puts them in that order, JEDP. He actually was given the task of writing the article on the history of ancient Israel in the Encyclopedia Britannica. And so his views transmitted from Germany to England to the United States, to where many in the academy hold these views today. First time I ever heard about this was as a freshman in college. Never heard about this in my life. And I had a professor of humanities. We were required to take the course. One day he came into class and he tried to demonstrate that Josiah's priests wrote the book of Deuteronomy in the 7th century, and that is not written by Moses in any way. Now, I was completely unprepared for this. I didn't know what to say other than, crazy professor, I don't believe what you got to say. And you may be thinking, I don't really care about this stuff. It's boring and it's unimportant. That's the kind of thinking that caused us to lose an entire generation of our young people. I'm going to repeat that again. This is boring. I don't care about this. Let's send my kid off to OU, to out of state, some college, and they will hear this stuff, and if they've not been prepared to understand where it's coming from, it is the kind of thinking that caused us to lose. We ought to bear this with shame. Throughout the history of the church, no generation until ours has hemorrhaged as many members. Are you ashamed? I'm ashamed. So this stuff is important, and I know it sounds boring. Documentary, that's a big word. Hypothesis, this sounds like something for the classroom. I'll tell you, it's taught in classrooms. It's taught in classrooms in secular universities. I later had a Greek professor at UCO who went full-fledged trying to teach us the documentary hypothesis, JEDP, laid it all out, tried to make the arguments for it. So this is commonly taught in our public universities, maybe even in high schools. I don't know, I didn't hear about it in high school, but in our public universities, this is commonly taught to say Moses had nothing to do with the construction of the law, that this was a product of time and evolution, the evolution of the nation of Israel. You might be thinking, Jay, well, so if you look at your English Bible, anytime you see the word Lord in all caps, that's referring to the name Yahweh. The Israelites didn't like to pronounce the name Yahweh. They thought that was tantamount to potentially taking the Lord's name in vain. So when they came to that word as they were reading their Bible, they would say Adonai, which is Hebrew for Lord. And so we've honored that tradition in the English translation. So anytime you come across Yahweh, it's translated as Lord in all capitals. And anytime you see the word God, it's Elohim. So that's the JEDP. All right, so what are some criticisms of the documentary hypothesis? Why is this not true? Well, the first reason it's not true, to me this is an insurmountable problem, is it totally lacks any material evidence. There is no single manuscript of J, E, D, or P. It doesn't exist. And not only does it not exist, no one ever seemed to have heard of it until the 1700s. There's just no material evidence for it whatsoever. It's completely hypothetical. The other problem, as theories go, it multiplies way too many hypotheses. And this is just some argument that you can make against a lot of bad theories. Well, let's just think hypothetically, maybe anytime the word Lord occurred, that's J, and anytime there was God, that's Elohim, and maybe those were two different pieces of paper that Moses had on his desk, or not Moses, some later scribe had on his desk, and maybe the Elohim story, in the Elohim stories, they seem to care a lot about Joseph, and Joseph was the father of Ephraim, and Ephraim was in the north. And after the north was destroyed, maybe some scribes came down from the north and brought their E source down to the south. And in the south, they had the J source. We don't know that they called God Yahweh exclusively in the south, but whatever, that's the hypothesis. And they crammed them together because they had to try to create a new nation existing from some people from the north and some people from the south, and they're separate. And, maybe Ezra, maybe he just decided to make up the priestly service when he came back and constructed most of the book of Leviticus. And maybe Josiah actually made up the book of Deuteronomy to establish national unity. I just rolled out like 50 hypotheses. And what's interesting about the hypothesis, the way hypotheses work, let's just give the benefit of the doubt. Let's say for every one thing I just said, it's 51% chance to be true. And if you take that times 50, that means there's like less than a fraction of 1% that theory is true. And it's what Occam's razor is. Anytime you multiply hypotheses, you got to stack a hypothesis on a hypothesis on a hypothesis. It may make a good story, but you're stacking hypotheses. It's almost certainly not true. The most true explanation is often the simplest one, just by the math of probability. And so if the book says it was written by Moses, until proven otherwise, we assume it was written by Moses. It's also, the documentary hypothesis was also based on a theory of the evolution of religion that was believed in the 1800s that's not believed anymore. That's actually one of the problems with the documentary hypothesis today, is that a lot of scholars don't believe it. They've rejected it. They've said, there's been various flavors of rejecting it, but most commonly it's like, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. You have zero evidence for it. So really the task upon the church is to just accept the book as we have it. That's a very common view. But even beyond that, as we've studied ancient religions, we've found that a lot of our assumptions about how they worked weren't true. And so a lot of what we were saying in the 1800s about the history of religion was also not true. Let me tell you how it used to go. And in the 1800s, the evolution was, because of Darwin, everyone was really excited about evolution, and so they tried to apply those principles in every other discipline academically. They tried it in politics. That's what led to social Darwinism, and ultimately, you know how that ends. It ends with genocide. But they also tried it in history. Well, maybe history happens on an evolutionary timeline. It looks like this. In the old world, people worshipped animals. Animalistic, pagan, killing birds, sprinkling ashes, just very, if they had a priest, it was a shaman. But they really didn't have a conception of God. They maybe had a conception of a spirit, right? Well, as time goes on, they deify those animals and they become the pagan gods. So the god of the harvest and the god of fertility and the god of this and that and the other. That's polytheistic. And the next evolution is, well, maybe there's just one true God. That's monotheism. And as it would happen, the final evolution is atheism. So from primitivism to polytheism to monotheism to atheism. That's how the argument goes. The problem is there's just no historical evidence that that ever happened. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. The Old Testament is witness to the fact that many monotheistic nations devolved into polytheism. It wasn't an evolution, but a devolution. Look at modern society. Paganism's made a comeback, people. It's very easy for a monotheistic belief system to crumble into polytheism. And frankly, I know some of you are more in touch with the culture than I am, know that animalism, something is my spirit animal. And, if I dance, I get in tune with my inner soul and I can shake off the chakras. That's like the primitive stuff. And that's made a comeback. Crystals. And I'm not talking about the meth kind. I'm talking about people who wave crystals around and burn sage. It's a thing. So we just know from study of our own history and study of ancient history that the whole theory that all religions evolved the same way over time, we just know that that's not true. And so to try to superimpose this view of the evolution of history upon the history of Israel, first of all, that view isn't true. And second of all, we have no evidence whatsoever that Israel ever went through that particular progression. And more than probably anything, the view of the evolutionary theory of history, of religion, is what undergirded JEDP. It started one way, you added E, then it got a little more formal, Deuteronomy, then the priests, and a high structure, high religion. That was the final form of it, and it's monotheism. No evidence at all that religions ever worked that way. But that was really common to believe in the 1800s. That doesn't mean it's any less taught in our schools or in our universities. If you were to ask my Greek professor at UCO, he would tell you that this was the settled results of science. That we know this. We don't have any manuscript evidence matter. We've concluded this is right. He also thought Timothy wrote the book of Timothy, so I don't know how well I took his opinion on a lot of things, but it's commonly taught. There's just no evidence for it whatsoever. All right, let's talk about the backgrounds, book of Exodus. So the authorship question, in spite of the many voices that say Moses had nothing to do with it, I think Moses wrote it. That's the simplest explanation. That's what the text asserts. That's what the overwhelming tradition of the Israelites, even down to the New Testament, asserts. All right, background of the Exodus. So I like to think about this next section as, imagine you're in Egypt as a slave, and imagine this scene here. You have an old member of the family sitting around a fire, the pyramids in the background. This was AI generated. And you have kids gathered around listening to the tales of, now this is something we do know that ancient cultures did. They loved to tell stories. They got so good at telling stories they could recite them word for word. And even modern cultures like in Africa or places where they haven't been so westernized, they still have this culture of telling stories and passing it down from generation to generation. So I'm imagining that. Imagine now you're in slavery in Egypt, and you've gathered around the fire with Grandpa, and he's telling you the stories that brought your people to this land of Egypt. And you listen to them, and you think about them, and you think about the God who called out Abraham from his home. You hear stories like this, Granddad and his call to adventure, and you fantasize that maybe God would do this for you. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all families of the earth shall be blessed." Can you imagine? In bitter, hard slavery, maybe your mother was killed, or your younger brother was murdered by the evil, tyrannical Egyptian regime in pursuit of the power-thirsty lust of Pharaoh. Maybe that's your story. Maybe you've seen your loved ones beaten and slaughtered, and you sit down to hear Grandpa tell a story, and he tells you about how God came to Abraham and said, "I'm going to curse those who curse you." I think that's really meaningful. And so even if they're hundreds of years removed from the events of Abraham, there's certainly, we know of this, of those cultures, those stories, those existed, those were passed down, those were cherished. I can't help but think just a few verses later, when Abram goes to Egypt and passes Sarah off as his wife, and so Pharaoh takes Sarah because Sarah is really good looking. Because we know this about the Hebrews, they're much better looking than the Egyptians. I mean, I don't know if that's like what they would have got from that, but I can imagine. And the Bible says the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And I can imagine the 9-year-old boy who watched his younger sister, or his younger brother rather, be murdered by the Egyptian regime. I can imagine him just dreaming and fantasizing about great plagues coming upon this Pharaoh because he opposed the children of Israel. And the story can go on, and they can talk about their crazy, jealous, finagling uncles. Think about the Roger Miller song, "With the Help of My Finagling Uncle." They got their crazy uncles. Everybody's got a few. Genesis 36, 26 through 28. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he's our brother and our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. If that wouldn't have happened, we wouldn't be here. We'd be back in Canaan, back in the land of our forefathers. But here we are. And you can think, no doubt, the children of Israel, sons of Joseph, pointing to the sons of the other brothers, saying, "It wasn't my granddaddy, it was your granddaddy. He's the one responsible for us being down here." But you might think that the story of Joseph leads them to hope, because Joseph also came to Egypt as a slave. But he didn't stay a slave. God was with him. And it's the riches to rags and back again story. And Pharaoh said to Joseph in Genesis 41:41, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Can you imagine how much the enslaved children of Israel would have longed to see one of their brethren elevated to the office of being over all the land of Egypt, just as their great-grandfather was? Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, "Bow the knee!" How many times did the children of Israel have to bow the knee before their taskmasters? And so hearing our grandfather tell us the story as we gather around the fire on a dry, warm night in Egypt, that means something. And so Joseph was set over all the land of Egypt. And you think of how that story continues. How Joseph and his father and son reunite. You know, one of the amazing things about the story of Joseph that really strikes me, it has every time I study this text, If you look at the passages leading up to Genesis 45, it's clear that Jacob is still alive. That's the whole point. If we can't go through with our plan and Benjamin's got to come down, it's going to kill our father. So the implication is Jacob is alive. But the first thing Joseph wants to know when he reveals his identity, he says to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. You know, the bond between father and son was very strong. It was very strong in the entire book of Genesis. You actually see this with the burial. You get these brothers that don't really like each other, like Isaac and Ishmael, presumably. I wouldn't imagine they're buddies, let's say that. Brothers that we know didn't like each other, like Jacob and Esau, and the Bible goes out of her way to tell us that they come back together for the burial of their father. The bond of father and son was very critical to them. And as they're sitting around hearing their elders tell them these stories, that is informing how they think as a family, as a people. I'm Joseph. Is my father still alive? And if you skip ahead to later in the chapter, this is to Jacob now. So, the first part of the chapter is Joseph saying to his brothers, is my father still alive? Later in the chapter, it's speaking to Jacob, and they told him, Joseph is still alive, and he is the ruler over all the land of Egypt. And his heart became numb, Jacob's heart, for he did not believe them. But when they told him all the words of Joseph, which he had said to them, and when he had saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And Israel said, it is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. Isn't that amazing? The family bond that brought them to Egypt. God now talks to Jacob, to Israel, as he's named. Next chapter, God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. Now God and Jacob had an interesting relationship, from the wrestling, the vision of the ladder up into heaven. I don't know that God ever spoke to Jacob words more meaningful to Jacob personally than these words. Here I am. And he said, I am the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt. For there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will bring you up again. Now, that right there is a good enough promise, right? Go down to Egypt. I'm going to make you a great nation, just as I promised to Abraham, your grandfather, and to Isaac, your father. I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to be good to you. I'm going to fulfill my promises to you. But I guarantee you, that's not what Jacob heard. The only thing Jacob heard of this whole promise was these closing words, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. The story of what brought the children of Israel down into Egypt is the story of a family. A family that, in spite of all kinds of problems, still loved each other and still had an identity as being the sons of Abraham, the children of Israel. Then Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to meet Israel, his father, in Goshen. He presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you're still alive. Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household, who are in the land of Canaan, have come to me. You may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. So this text tells us how they got to where they were in Egypt, dwelling in the land of Goshen, all through the providence of Joseph, all through the reuniting of a father and a son. And so now we come to the opening verses of the book of Exodus. We already said that the book of Exodus is named in the Hebrew Bible. These are the names. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. As the kids sit around Grandpa hearing this story, this is the part that they know. Present day. Slavery, tyranny, oppression, murder, hatred. But they have a story that is not over. And that brings us to the key themes of the book of Exodus. First of all, and perhaps the most important theme, is that God remembers his covenant with the patriarchs. Now go back to Genesis 15, when God is making, and one of the many promises he made to Abraham, he says, "The Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions." God promised to Abraham very specifically, there's going to be centuries of tyranny and affliction and oppression, but I'm going to bring your descendants out. They will come out with great possessions. And that really is the overarching theme of the book of Exodus, that God is true to his covenant promise and to his covenant people. Second theme, we already saw this tonight in Warren's lesson. God rules over the nations. In the song of Moses, after they crossed the Red Sea and they burst out into song, "Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders?" God rules over the nations, even Egypt, the world power of the time. Nobody could hold a candle to Egypt. And God ruled over them and treated them as if they were nothing. That's a major theme of the book of Exodus. The next theme is that God establishes a constitutional nation. We're going over, I apologize, but we're going to talk about why that's important. In Exodus 19:5-6, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." The priest is the one who could come near God. And so, as a kingdom of priests, they were the nation that could come near God. And remember how we define holiness? That which comes close to God. That's why they're a holy nation. And their existence as this treasured possession and as this nation is contingent. Because he says, "If you will indeed obey my voice." That is what made them a nation. Their joint allegiance to this law. They did not have a king, not at this point. They didn't have leaders in the traditional sense. They didn't have a land. If you think about what makes a nation, usually it's we share the same king or we share the same land. So if you're in medieval England, what made you a nation, or what determined the particular boundaries of your nation, was who was allegiant to the king. Or did you share the same island or the same region geographically? They had neither of these things. They didn't have a land, not yet. They didn't have a king, not yet. But they were still a nation. What bound them together as a nation was their allegiance and their commitment to obey the law. And so God is doing something here in nationcraft, if you will, that is unprecedented. Now, there were laws that came before. We'll mention those in a moment. But there were no constitutional nations, not like this. All the laws came from the king. If you do this, this shall be the result. America is the closest thing I can think of that actually approximates this. When someone enters the armed forces or takes the oath of office, they don't swear, first and foremost, to protect the president or to protect the geography associated with the United States. They swear to defend the Constitution. That's what binds us as a people. If the Constitution didn't exist, we wouldn't be a nation. If the law didn't exist, they would not be a nation. So God is establishing a constitutional nation, fundamentally different in its construction from the bedrock up than any other nation of the time. Now, there were many laws that predated the law of Moses, and these we actually have copies of. They have been found. I have no doubt that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of other law codes that have been lost. But here's the 5 big ones that predate the law of Moses. Ernamu, Eshnuna, Lipit, Ishtar, Hammurabi, you heard of that one, I'm sure, in the Hittite laws, that just barely predate Moses, and for the most part are actually contemporary with Moses. I'll give you some examples of these laws because they're very different from the law of Moses, very different in a very important way. So Ernamu, here's an example of one. If a man's slave woman compares herself to her mistress, speaks insolently to her, her mouth shall be scoured with 1 quart of salt. If a man knocks out the tooth of another man, he shall pay 2 shekels of silver. They're all that way. If this thing happens, this is the punishment, or this is the restitution. This is what must be done to make right. Eshnuna, this is a kind of a complicated one. This is a fascinating one. If a man took a man's daughter without asking her father, so marries her, takes a woman to be his wife, doesn't ask her father or her mother, and subsequently did not fix a marriage feast or contract with her father and mother, even if she should dwell in his house the days of 1 year, she is not his wife. In other words, you got to get permission from mom and dad. If not, doesn't count. If he subsequently fixed a contract and or marriage feast for her father and her mother and took her a wife, the day in the lap of a man she will be seized, one shall die, shall not live. So in that case, okay, your wife and adultery laws would kick in. But you see, it's the same structure. If this set of things happens under this set of circumstances, here's what happens. Lipit Ishtar. If an owner of an estate has not paid taxes for the estate and another person has paid it, it is forbidden to evict the person from the estate within 3 years. Then the person who paid the estate tax becomes the owner of the estate. Same thing. If this thing happens with a set of circumstances, this is what you do. Hammurabi. If a builder constructs a house for a man that does not conform to specifications so that a wall then buckles, that builder shall make that wall sound using his own silver. There was a promise of a warranty, a lifetime warranty. I kind of like that one. That's Hammurabi, same structure. If this thing happens, under these circumstances, here's what the law says to do. In an example of a Hittite law, if a free man kills a snake, I love this one because I have a point to make about this. If a free man kills a snake and speaks another's name while killing it, he shall pay 40 shekels of silver. If he is a slave, however, he himself shall be executed. Now, if you're killing a snake and you say someone else's name over that snake as you're killing the snake, if you're a slave, you will be put to death. If not, you got to pay the owner 40 shekels of silver. I like this one because it shows something about the paranoia of paganism. Well, if you kill a snake and you say someone's name, that's like a voodoo doll, right? It's like, death to my enemies as I'm killing the snake. You can't do that. That's you're bringing a curse on somebody. There are a lot of people in the world today, and especially in the ancient world, who thought that kind of thing were real. Now imagine if I were to. There are a lot of laws in the law of Moses that appear strange to us. Now imagine, there's not a law that says this, but I just want you to think hypothetically. Imagine you came to a law in the law of Moses that says, you shall not say the name of a man over the snake you kill. We would look at that and say, how weird. How strange. God must be arbitrary. This must be an arbitrary test, just to test that people won't do that. No, I mean, if you read that law, you would make the conclusion that that was a pretty common pagan practice, and God says, you shall have none of that. So when you come to a law that is in Scripture, like this, it's the last law of the book of the covenant. So, like, you would think that Moses or God would go out with them. You shall not boil a goat in his mother's milk, so says Moses. Now, you might think that's just an arbitrary, capricious law, but that's not at all the case. That is God saying, you shall not look, act, and behave like the pagan nations. You're different than that. But you see a lot of that in these other law codes. Every single one of them are what we call casuistic or case law. That was how law was constructed before Moses. If this, then that. If you say the name of a man after you kill a snake, and then you pay 40 shekels. Case law. But there's another kind of law called apodictic law, which is absolute law that is true under every circumstance, and it's not conditional on a case. And every one of the 10 Commandments goes in the former. It is not, if you shall make a graven image, then you shall pay the fine. If you shall commit adultery, then here's what. It's make no graven image. Do not commit adultery. Do not kill. Do not take the Lord's name in vain. Honor, positively, commanding you, honor your father and your mother. Do not covet. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. They're not case law. Now, the law of Moses has a lot of case law in it, but the core of Moses are these 10 firm, eternal, if you will, the Sabbath is a debate, but these 10 laws that were directly from the mouth of God. You see why that's important? Because in the 10 Commandments, Moses, in this writing through God, or I should say God through Moses, is fundamentally reshaping how we think about morality. Because heretofore, morality was, number one, it came from the king. It was the king's decision. And two, it was all conditioned on the circumstance. Well, if these things happen, then this is what we do, and that's how we restore civil justice. But when you come to the law of Moses, it's, you shall have no other God before me. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not kill. You shall not bear false witness. You see how that's different? And why that's so important? Because Moses tells us that law, and the violation of that law, is a violation of the will of God. Not the will of the king. There is no king. This law did not come from Hammurabi or any of the other kings. This law came from God. And that also tells us that morals are absolute. And when something is wrong, it is wrong in every possible circumstance. It's not okay to steal under some sort. It's wrong. It's a law. You shall not steal. It's not okay to covet under some sort. Well, if the occasion is right and if the guy's wearing blue and it's a Thursday afternoon, it's okay to covet. It's not okay to covet. God gives an absolute law, and that's a fundamental difference from the laws that come before Moses. God is establishing a nation that is governed by absolute, divinely revealed morality. And the final thing we want to think about is this. God abides with his people. Exodus 33:15 through 16. Now, this is where God says, I'm not going to go with you anymore. You rebelled. You broke my laws. You broke my commands. I'm interrupting all this important stuff. I'm telling Moses about the tabernacle so I can come down and kill these rebels. That's what's happening. That's the context here. And he said, Moses, speaking to God, Moses says, if your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not in your going with us so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth? God, if you're not with us, we're just like everybody else, and I don't want to be like everybody else. And so a major theme, especially in the second half of the book of Exodus, is that God's presence abides with his people. When they come to the tabernacle and it's completed, God's presence rushes in to fill the tabernacle. And there it remained and stayed until it was defiled in the days of Hophni and Phinehas. It once again resumed its place in the days of Solomon till it was defiled in the time of Ezekiel. It once again found residence in Israel in the days of Jesus of Nazareth. And God has said, my presence will be in the church. I will be with you always, Jesus says, even unto the end of the age. See, in the Christian age, God's presence is not conditioned as it was for them. God nearly left them then. Moses had to intercede. Well, there was no intercessor in the days of Hophni and Phinehas, and there wasn't one in the days of Ezekiel. But what happens to this condition where God comes, God leaves, depending on our obedience? If we're obedient, he'll stay. If we disobey, he goes. Unless we have an intercessor who can keep him there. What happens in that formula when you have an intercessor who stands before the throne eternally, making intercession for the saints? God's presence never leaves. He won't leave. Because if God, under the intercession of Moses, agreed to stay with the children of Israel, how much more will God abide in his church today? And so I think we learn something really important from the book of Exodus about God's presence that is eminently applicable to us today. And that's the presence of God in his people. That's the presence of God in this church. That's the presence of God when we leave and go get ice cream. Hint, hint, I don't know, maybe. The presence of God with us wherever we go. Now, Moses says, if you don't go with us, then people are going to look at us and say, you're just like every other nation on the earth. But because God goes with us, people look at us and say, that is someone who is different. That is someone who is redeemed. That is someone who is freed from the bondage of sin. God abides with his people. Last slide. This is the outline for the rest of this month. So we talked about Exodus in the Bible. We talked about the authorship question. I know that got a little bit complicated, but I hope that was helpful for you. We talked about the major themes. We talked about the background, what brought the children of Israel to this point in Egypt. remaining in this month, we're going to next week talk about the Exodus and history. We talked about those 2 dates. That's the early and late date. I think Dustin's going to talk about that. Did this happen, and does it matter? The week after that, Steve is going to lead a study on Exodus and Jesus. There's so much about Jesus that can be seen in the Exodus. The reading from that night comes from 1 Corinthians 10, where Paul explicitly says Jesus was there. And the final Wednesday night of this month, Caleb will talk about Exodus and the believer. How does this book change how I live? And this is not just about learning about the history of it. I mean, if we walk away from this and we know our Bibles a little bit better, then that's not a lost effort. But it will be so much more meaningful if we walk away from this study a year from now and we understand what it means to us and how I can position myself with relation to God, how I can approach him and become more like him in holiness. In holiness. I want to conclude by thinking about, I've gone over, I beg your, I know that you guys have nowhere to go, so. 1 Thessalonians 5:23, now may the God of peace himself sanctify. Sanctify, what does that word mean? Well, in the Greek, it's akin to the word for holy. It means literally make holy. So now may the God of peace himself make you holy completely, and may your whole spirit and soul and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. He who calls you is faithful. He will surely do it. Now, do you realize the weight of what we just read? Jesus is coming again, and in advance of that, we are approaching the Holy of Holies. He says you're being made holy, and we know what holiness is. Holy is that which approaches God. Something that is close to God is holy. And so he says, my prayer for you, he says, is that as you await the return of Jesus, your whole spirit, soul, and body will be made holy. That means that within the course of our life, we are ever approaching the throne of God, being made more holy, more blameless, until finally Jesus is revealed at his return and we are perfected. That's what that text means. And he says this, God is faithful. He will surely do it. Are you being more holy throughout the course of your life? Throughout the course of your life, are you drawing nearer and finding yourself closer to God in your thoughts and attitudes, words and actions? Or are you drifting? Are you going further and further outside the camp, and you think back to times in your life where you think maybe you approximated holiness in some way, but boy, not really anymore, and the idea of being like God is a distant memory, fading as you walk further and further and further away from the presence of God? See, God's plan for you is for you to become more holy over the course of your life. That's what this text says. It's a progression. It's a progression. Are we becoming more and more holy as we approach God's throne at the Holy of Holies? That's the challenge for you. I think it's a challenge for us as we study this book. That's Caleb's challenge in a few weeks. How does this apply to me? How can I learn to be more like God? Thank you for your attention tonight. It has gone long. I apologize. I hope this has been beneficial for you. I hope this has given you some anticipation for the study for the rest of the month. If you need the help the rest of the year, if you need the help of the church in any way, if you need to put on the Lord in baptism, we'd love to help you. Won't you come as we stand and sing?